Hello, my A1 Algebra 3 students. We are ready for another exciting trip online. And today we're going to be discussing how to find the equations of the asymptotes of the hyperbola. And the very first thing that we're going to do, we're going to review the equation for finding the slope. So if you're given 2 points on a line, then the slope equation, m equals y sub 2 minus y sub 1 divided by x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And remember, this numerator is the difference or the change in the y's, and the denominator is the difference or the change in the x. And also, let us also review that if we're moving from left to right and the line is going up, it's going to have a positive slope. If we're moving from left to right and the line is going down, then we're going to have a negative slope. So here is a general equation for the asymptotes of the hyperbola. It's y is equal to plus or minus, because you're going to have one slope that's positive and the other slope that's negative. The square root of the denominator under the y term divided by the square root of the denominator under the x term times x. So let's look at an example of this. Here we have the hyperbola x squared divided by a squared minus y squared divided by b squared equals 1. And this, remember, this has a horizontal transverse axis because the x term is the positive one. But it's also going to have two asymptotes, one positive and one negative. So let's look at an example of that. Here we have this equation for the ellipse. The a squared is 25, the b squared is 16. So to find the equation of the ellipse is going to be y equals plus or minus the square root of the denominator under the y term divided by the square root of the number under the denominator under the x term. So it becomes y equals plus or minus 4/5 times x. Those are the two equations of our asymptotes. And we remember that the transverse axis is horizontal because the x term is the positive, because, let me pull it back down, because the x term is the what? Positive term. So that's how we knew that it was going to have a horizontal transverse axis from yesterday. Let's look at this equation. The hyperbola, we have the y squared divided by a squared minus the x squared divided by b squared equals 1. This has a vertical transverse axis because the y term is positive, and it's also going to have two asymptotes, one positive slope and one negative slope. So let's look at this example. We're given this equation, and the number under the y term is 36. So it's going to be y equals plus or minus the square root of the denominator under the y term divided by the square root of the denominator under the x term. So we're getting 6/2, which reduces to what? 3. So the equations of the asymptotes will be y equals plus or minus 3. And remember, here we're going to have a transverse axis that is vertical because the y term is positive, here. Now let's look at some general equations about what we were talking about. We've already done an example like this, but you see where the b squared is under the y term? And remember, that's going to be our numerator. So it's going to be plus or minus the square root of b squared over the square root of a squared. So you see it's going to be plus or minus b over a times x. We also looked at an example where the y term was positive. And you see the term under the y term is what? The a squared. Remember, the a squared, when you're doing the hyperbola, is always under the positive term. But you see, it's the denominator under the y term divided by the denominator, the square root of the denominator under the y term, divided by the square root of the denominator of the x term. So that is where we're getting what are plus or minus. So this again is a general equation here. And then I wanted you to look at this. when we get ready to sketch these, you see where here where the x term is a positive term, we have the branches opening left and right. We're going to have a horizontal transverse axis, but you see the asymptote. This one is what the positive one, and this one is what the negative one. Also here, we have this equation where the positive term is the y, and we're going to have the branches opening up and down, and we're going to have a vertical transverse axis. And the a squared is under the y term, so it's going to be plus or minus the square root of a squared, which is a, you see a, all divided by the square root of the term under the denominator under the x term, which is the b squared, so it would be b in the denominator. So we have therefore that the asymptotes equations be y equals plus or minus a over b times x. And always, when you're doing this, always remember to go back, stop, rewind, and review. Stop, rewind, and review. And remember that what we were doing today, we were finding what? The equations of the asymptotes. My love goes out to you.